In a South Africa where you're often bombarded with messaging about why the country is going to fail, something we're stressing really hard is the countervailing forces, the arguments about why the country can succeed. And one of those that you'll read a lot about if you start to read us is the question of private entry on the back of state failure. And a very well established South African trend now is that where the state fails to meet its obligations, we're seeing macro level private entry to take over what were once state functions at a scale that mitigates a lot of the damage that might otherwise have followed. So South Africans have seen that on the question of crime and policing on a vast scale. There was 30 years ago an equivalent ratio of a people to police officer as there were people to private security officer. But today, that ratio is vastly in favor of the private security industry. When Transnet began to fail, we saw macro level shift in how freight was transported in South Africa onto the road network, which is essentially privately run. There's a wonderful trend line that exists between breakdowns of Eskom plant and equipment and the installation of solar rooftop technology in South Africa. And if we're approached by someone who's got a long-term interest in the country and wishes to know how we think it's all going to turn out, one of the points we stress for them is that to do well in South Africa, don't just close the door on the first encounter with state failure. Realize that South Africa is pioneering something that's very different to what happened in other emerging markets 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. What's being pioneered here is that where the state withdraws, massive private entry is following in the wake of that, meaning that what might otherwise have been a more serious problem is mitigated to a significant extent, and we think a sufficient extent to continue to argue the case that despite the many challenges South Africa confronts, there are really solid arguments that can be made about why the country can become a enormously successful emerging market into the 2030s.